Good evening, folks, and welcome to Woodstock Regional Artists. I'm your host, Sal Miccio, coming to you from my home studio in West Hurley, New York, along with David Lax, our producer engineer, at the controls at Studio A in Saugerties, New York. Tonight's guest is a guitarist, percussionist, composer, and vocalist, Peter Blum. Good evening, Peter, and welcome to the show.
Sal, it's my pleasure to be on. Thank you.
Let me ask you a question. What was your first instrument of choice when you started getting involved in music?
Well, right around the same time, right about when I was 12 or 13, I picked up both the guitar and when I was bar mitzvahed, which is a rite of passage for little Jewish boys when they turn 13, I asked my parents for a kunga drum. So I started banging on the kunga drum and learning some folk and blues stuff on the guitar right around the same time.
And you played a little harmonica too. Is that?
Yeah, shortly after, right around that time, a year or so later, I was listening to some old Library of Congress and Folkways recordings of Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee, and I loved it. And you know, harmonica is so easy to carry around with you. So I started playing it and, you know, working out with blues with other friends who were playing the guitar. And it was actually the very first instrument that I ever performed in public setting on a stage with the Hohner A harmonica.
Okay. So when did you begin experimenting with various percussion instruments?
Gee, you know, you'd have to count the kunga drum as a percussion instrument. So that was the beginning. But I always, you know, was like banging on stuff and finding odd sounds that metal pots and pans would make, anything like that. But my real, I guess, introduction to things other than drumming was in the 70s, early 80s, mid 80s. I was hearing recordings of what are called Tibetan or Himalayan singing bowls, and the sound was amazing. It was fascinating, and it put me into an altered state of consciousness right away. And I found one, and they're played by either striking them or going around the edge of them, and I began collecting them. So that led to other metal, what are called in the category what are called sacred singing metals, gongs and steel hand pans and so forth. So that, along with shakers and bells and these little instruments here that are called ting sha, which are often struck at the beginning of a meditation to call people's attention. So those sounds fascinating.
Interesting, yeah. Have you ever been up to the monastery and chanted with the monks?
Oh, I've been up at the monastery many, many times. I am what is called a Jew-boo, which is born Jewish, practicing Buddhist. And so I have a very close affiliation with that lineage of Tibetan Buddhism and with the teachers up at the monastery.
That's terrific.
And even before I got involved, when I heard recordings in the 70s, there were some sounds from the roof of the world. And there was recordings that were field recordings that were made at these tantric colleges of these monks chanting. And I was, again, just like with the Himalayan bowls, I was drawn to this sound. And I was like, what is that sound? What is it about it that just transports me to another realm immediately? So I've been pursuing that on my own, various forms of what is called extended vocal techniques for decades. Yeah.
Right. It says here in the 70s you were a student at Creative Music Studio, and you wrote music for and performed with Mwanda, a 12-piece ensemble including 4 dancers. Tell me something about that.
Well, let me just roll back a little bit because I want to go back and give credit to my dad. My father was an operatic baritone, And so there was music in the house, classical music, and he'd be driving the car and just singing at the top of his lungs. He was so in love with the sound of the voice, and I think I must have gotten some of that from him. And the love, there was a piano in the house, and my mom and dad used to sing duets together. So I grew up with the idea that music is an art, but also a passion, and pursuing it, and it was always something that's been in my life. So having studied guitar and been listened to all forms of music, starting with folk and blues, and then moving into R&B, and then listening to lots of jazz and avant-garde music and free jazz, and then in the early 70s, I moved to Woodstock in 1969, and around 72 or 3, friends of mine told me about this amazing situation where they were teaching Carl Berger and his wife Ingrid. Dr. Carl had moved up from New York, and they had founded, along with Ornette Coleman, the Creative Music Studio. And classes were being held in a barn on Witch Tree Road. And I went over there with my buddy Mark Black, who I've known and played with on and off for years, and we participated in these classes that were called Basic Tuning and Basic Timing. And I learned, things there that I still use in my improvising and composing. Nobody had ever really, I had never studied music formally. And I had a kind of like, I didn't want to learn how to read music. And Carl bypassed all of that. He said, you don't need to. And it was an oral tradition of teaching by doing in group, and it was fabulous. So that was a real petri dish at the time. It just was drawing students, and many people who came to the area and stayed here. Many of our finest, Marilyn Crispell and others who came originally for the Creative Music Studio and just stayed, and you could go and take a class with Jack DeJohnette or Dave Holland. I mean, it was 15, 20 people, master classes. So that was a big influence. And I met and started, just jamming with different people. Donnie Davis, a great saxophone player, and we would get together with some dancers and just improvise music for them to move to. They would improvise movement, and we would make music. And after doing this for about a year or so, people started bringing in compositions they were working on and saying, here's an opportunity for us to work on this. And I was one of those people who was composing. And one of the things I learned at Creative Music Studio was to think outside of the 4/4 rhythm. So I was composing things in 13 or 22 rhythm cycles. And these people understood that because they were studying the same way of breaking time down into 2s and 3s. So we had a lot of fun with that. And after a while, we realized we had something we could present to the public because the dancers had choreographed things to these compositions. So for about a year or two, 77, 78, we gave a few concerts. And it was always a question whether we would have more people in the audience than we had performing. Because we had 8 musicians and 4 dancers. So sometimes we'd have 6 people in the audience. But that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting. I think at this time we'll show one of the videos that we have. It's just called "Chanting with Shruti in Tutum Jungle." That was interesting, Peter. Were you actually in the jungle when you did that?
Yeah, I was. I was. One of my fascinations, a person I studied with in the 80s and 90s was the wonderful composer and uh, performer Pauline Oliveros. And she was a big influence on me. And Pauline introduced me to the idea of seeking out energetically and acoustically special places to perform in. And so I was invited by a friend of mine who had built, hacked out of the jungle outside of Tulum, Mexico, which is on the area stretch called the Mayan Riviera. And back in off the seacoast in the jungle, he had built this house, which he invited me to come down and stay in. And he said, "You can stay with me." This was about 2 or 3 years ago. "You can stay at no charge as my guest. The only thing I'm asking is to bring some instruments down and do some playing for my friends." And he said, I built a structure out in the jungle. We have to walk through the jungle into this six-sided structure. There's something about that. They raises bees and the hexagonal shape. And we went into this structure. And I brought something called the Shruti box, which people have just seen, which is a little drone instrument that you play. And I was so moved by this opportunity to just be there. I hadn't planned on doing it. I just started playing it and chanting, and it was great. It was great.
Wow. Yeah. Sounds interesting. So in the 80s, you composed and performed in a BBC, a trio featuring guitar, sarod, and tablas. Who was in that band?
Well, in 1978, I had moved to live in Amsterdam, Holland. And while I was there, I had always had a fascination with North Indian classical music and listening to Ravi Shankar and other great exponents on the sitar and sarod, which are the main stringed instruments from that
Right.
tradition. And I had the opportunity to study with a great maestro, Ustad Jamaluddin Bhartiya, who was, in fact, Ravi Shankar's first and oldest student. And he was considered a great maestro. And so I had learned some of the rudiments of the raga system, which is, and he tried to teach me on sitar, and I studied with him for 3 years. But when I came back to the States, I went back to the guitar, playing it in open tunings and trying to get those bends and trills and ornamentation that you hear on the sitar. And the idea of resonance has always attracted me. The long sounds that hang in the air, the bowls and the gongs do that. And tuning a guitar to an open tuning gives you a lot of sympathetic strings that resonate when you don't hit them.
Uh-huh.
So it rings longer. So I had met this fellow who was a student at the Ali Akbar Khan College of Music out in California, and a senior student out there named Montino Bourbon del Monte. And Montino played the sarod. And he and I were jamming, and we found a young fellow named Jerry Coffey who was studying the tabla, which are the two tuned hand drums that are often accompanying
Right.
the instrumentalist, the rhythmic accompaniment. And we started again jamming and playing together and worked up a repertoire and performed for a year or two with that, that grouping. And again, I had the
Nice.
opportunity to compose tunes and hear them performed with this instrumentation, which was great, very rewarding.
Nice. In the 90s, you also performed and recorded with a trio called Older Than Dirt, along with Mark Black and Michael Esposito, two of my favorite people. How did that go?
Well, Mark was someone, as I said, I met in the early 70s. We hung out at Creative Music Studio, and we always enjoyed, we had a real rapport. Just two guitar players who had listened to a lot of the same stuff playing. And Mark is a wonderful vocalist and composer. He's written one great songs, and he was also into odd banging on. We used to jam. He'd say, "Look what I found." He'd pull out an egg slicer and show me the sound that stroking the egg slicer could make. We were just looking for any sound, And so we put together this trio, and Mark had the idea of recording something that was like folky but acidy and also a kind, ambient sounds, and so we recorded some tunes as a trio with two guitars and Michael Esposito playing
Play
bass
bass. Yeah.
and Mark singing. But we also went into the clubhouse in Great Stu Recording Studio, which I think is now in Rhinebeck. At that time, it was in Germantown, and
Okay.
it was a huge building, and we just set up uh, stations with microphones hanging over them with frame drums and rattles and balafons, which is a wooden xylophone, vibraphone from Africa, and shakers and whistling tubes. And we just go and Mark said to the engineer, "You are the fourth member of this improvising quartet. You have permission as we're going along to play with effects and do whatever you want." So on the spot, in real time, we were hearing in our headphones greatly distorted and echoed out and delayed things. So we had a lot of fun with that. And then Mark mixed it all down and put it into a recording.
That sounds like a fun time.
We
Yeah.
did a few
Terrific.
performances at Unison and at the Dharmaware Cafe and here and there. Yeah.
Cool. Let's go into your second video here. It's with your performing group, This. It's a sound bath at Opus 40. Let's listen to it, watch it, and talk about it on the other side. Who are the folks in that video, please?
That particular incarnation at Opus 40 was Naz Hosseini, who is my longtime collaborator, wonderful vocalist and violinist, and somebody I can just throw any idea at and she'll come right back. She worked with Meredith Monk for a long time as a dancer and vocalist, so she's
Uh-huh.
got her credentials. And the inimitable Steve Gorn, everybody's favorite Bansarai flute player, he's a world-class player. And David Budd, who's an old friend of mine, who plays the didgeridoo and frame drum, had studied with Lane Redmond and is a general percussionist and good guy. So those were the four people there.
You have had a number of uh, teachers. I know Carl Berger was one.
Ustad Jamaluddin Bhartia. It took me a little
Yes.
while to learn how to pronounce that correctly also. From the North Indian tradition, teaching sitar, Carl Berger and other teachers at Creative Music Studio, Pauline Oliveros. In addition, I met a Native American mystic and medicine person named Joseph Real. As I got more and more involved with sacred singing medals, I sought out teachers in that realm and with extended vocal techniques. So I studied with a French gentleman named Fabien Mamon, who's a sound healer, with Don Conroe, with a local fellow, John Beaulieu, who is known as the tuning fork maestro. And I learned a lot about how to use tuning forks with John. Also, extended vocal techniques with Jill Peirce, and most recently with another wonderful local treasure, Timothy Hill, who worked with David Hikes in the Harmonic Choir for a long time.
Very
He
nice.
teaches what he calls harmonic singing.
Well, the next video is the Pandemic Duo, and this is with Naz Hosseini, and it's a pleasurable thing to watch. That was very enjoyable,
Thank you.
Peter. Tell us about that.
Well, in the middle of all of this, I was invited by some friends in Mexico who had the idea of running a uplifting series of Zoom um, once a week of sound healers. And they're in San Miguel de Allende in Mexico, which is an inland. But they contacted me and asked if I would be interested in doing this. Yes, and then I reached out to David, who is my neighbor, who lives right down the road, the esteemed David Lax, and asked if he would shoot something, and we went over and he set up a beautiful. It's the most professional video I think we've done.
So, over the past 30 years, you've concentrated on performing and recording sounds intended to support meditation and healing. And you have a number of CDs, uh, mostly featuring the Himalayan singing bowls.
This is Pulse Field, featuring Naz Hosseini and David Budd. This is Singing Bowls and One, a double CD featuring duets with singing bowls improvised with 12 or 13 different musicians, one at a time. And this is a live performance recorded of a quartet, a sound bath quartet featuring Steve Gorn, Naz Hosseini, Thomas Workman, and myself. And this is 13 Dreams, most recently just released.
Where can folks find all these CDs?
Well, all of them except for the most recent one are available on my website, soundsforhealing.com.
Okay.
You can listen to little clips from them and order them directly through the website.
Peter, you have given workshops and concerts at the Omega Institute, Abode of the Message, International Hypnosis Federation, Menla Retreat Center, and United Nations. That's interesting. What did you do at the United Nations?
Well, this same friend of mine who had invited me down to his place in Tulum, Mexico, was presenting at an NGO, a non-governmental organization that has permission to meet at the United Nations, and they're a spiritual meditation group, and he invited us to come in and set up.
So we're going to go to the next and last video. It's a very interesting video. It's called Septic Sonics. Well, that was a interesting video. Tell us
Well,
how that came about, Peter.
one of the pieces of advice that beautiful painted arrow, my Native American shaman teacher, gave me, he said, if you want to follow this path, go where you're invited. And I got this phone call one time, not that long ago, from David, and he said, "Where are you?" And I said, "I'm driving. I'm coming back from Rhinebeck. Can you get here in the next hour? We have a very extraordinary opportunity, but there's a small window of time, and bring a few instruments." And I went over there, and he had just gotten the septic tank delivered, which was going to be buried in the ground the following day. But he said, it's got an extraordinary echo. It's got an amazing resonance. And we're going to climb down. It was like going down into a mini submarine, down this ladder into it. And there was just enough room for me to set up. And I brought a one small gong and a large frame drum and the Shruti box. And yes, it was extraordinary. And David crawled down there with his camera and a light and videotaped it. And we were both delighted with what came out of it. It was just one of those spontaneous moments,
Very unusual opportunity.
Yeah. Who would think of doing that? But
really,
there you go. Right?
Terrific.
So a lot of what I'm interested in, which may be coming clearer as people, I don't know, is the idea of sound and music not just for entertainment, although there's nothing wrong with that, and I've done my share of that, but as a way of entering into a space of clarity and peacefulness and meditation. And this is been around all around the world in many cultures. It goes way, way back. And so setting the intention and finding instruments that support that, and then creating environments where that can happen. So many of our sound baths and sound immersions and sound happenings or whatever that we've done have been in yoga studios, and we call them horizontal concerts. And we ask people to bring a mat or a blanket and just lay down and just go off into dreamland and let these sounds carry you, and wherever you go, you'll find something nice.
Right. You have multiple awards as a hypnotherapist and an author of Transonics, the visual link between sound healing and hypnosis.
So I wrote this book, which is still in the self-published spiral-bound stage.
So we're coming to an end of the show, and I'd like to announce your website again. It's soundsforhealing.com, and that's probably a place people should go to find your CDs, right?
Absolutely, the book.
And you do have a Facebook page, Sounds for Healing. And so I hope that folks will go out to your website and take the opportunity to check out your CDs. It's been a great time spending with you. We've learned a lot about hypnosis and healing and chanting. I know I've learned a lot, and it's really a pleasure to have you on our show. I want to thank you for spending time with us, and I hope we can get to see you live again soon out there after this pandemic is over.
Well, actually, after a 6-month hiatus, we are going to very cautiously do something September 20th outdoors in behind Mountain View Studio, right in Woodstock. Tom, the owner, has built a beautiful stage and with socially distanced seating in a circle around it, in a little glen in the woods. And so I'll be performing with Naz Hosseini and Ev Mann on the 20th at 5:30.
Thank you very much for being on our show, Peter. It's been a pleasure.
Okay.
Folks, that's our show for tonight. We'll have another special guest for you next Tuesday. Until then, be safe out there and support your local artists in any way you can.